Thank you so much for inviting me. I'd like to talk about some new understanding on sorting circuits. We've been working on this line of work since 2017, so I'll mention the results from a few papers to paint essentially the frontier of our understanding. This is joint work with many wonderful collaborators. Some of these studies were also partly motivated by a somewhat different quest, that is how to construct optimal oblivious RAM. Although in this talk, I'll mostly focus on the circuit model rather than the ORAM. At the end of the talk, however, I'll quickly mention how the circuit results are related to the optimal ORAM and how they are not related. Like, in other words, how the circuit techniques actually depart from the techniques we use to construct optimal ORAM. I'll only have time to mention the results, and you'll have to read our paper for the details. Sorting circuits have been studied for many decades. A long-standing open question in the complexity and algorithms literature is the following. Does there exist sorting circuit of little o n log n in size? So what do we know about this question? First, we know that to get anything better than n log n, it cannot be comparison-based. Comparison-based has a well-known n log n lower bound, and this lower bound applies no matter whether it's the RAM model or circuit model. If we forego the comparison-based requirement, however, we know that on the RAM, sorting can be accomplished in nearly linear time. Unfortunately, these RAM algorithms critically rely on dynamic memory accesses and cannot be converted to the circuit model in a way that preserves efficiency. Okay, so we've been stuck on this question for several decades. As I mentioned, this is one of the well-known long-standing open questions in the complexity and algorithms literature. Somehow we cannot make progress either on the upper bound or lower bound front. In some sense, it's almost surprising that after so many years, we still don't understand sorting circuits. So let's see why we are so stuck. On the upper bound front, we are stuck at the AKS sorting network from 1983. The AKS sorting network is comparison-based, so it is actually optimal in the comparator-based model. A long-standing question is, can we beat AKS if we forego the comparison-based restriction? It turns out that we haven't made any progress at all along this front. On the lower bound side, we also seem to be pretty stuck. In fact, not only do we not know how to prove n log n lower bound on sorting circuits, in fact, we don't know how to prove a superlinear lower bound. And in fact, it turns out proving superlinear circuit lower bound for any problem in e to the np is beyond the reach of current techniques. Okay, despite all these long-standing barriers, we were able to make a little progress in terms of understanding sorting circuit complexity, both on the upper bound and the lower bound fronts. On the upper bound side, somewhat imprecisely speaking, we show that sorting n elements, each tagged with a k-bit key, can be accomplished with the circuit of size n times k. So if, for example, k is asymptotically smaller than log n, we can actually defeat the AKS sorting network. Our result can also be viewed as a generalization of the AKS sorting circuit. Note that I'm ignoring polylog star terms in the bound. On the lower bound side, we show that essentially the above upper bound is tight for every choice of k, either assuming the indivisibility model or assuming the Lilly network coding conjecture. So let me explain. The indivisibility model assumes that the element's payload strings are opaque, and the circuit does not perform any encoding or computation on the element's payload strings. And indeed, almost all of the algorithms we know are indeed in the indivisibility model. Now, the Lilly conjecture is a well-known conjecture in the area of network coding. It posits that network coding cannot help anything beyond the standard multi-commodity flow rate, in undirected graphs. So while no one knows how to prove unconditional superlinear circuit lower bounds, we were able to prove a conditional lower bound. And the lower bound also implies that if the linear coding conjecture is true, then one cannot build a sorting circuit of little o n log n size for the case of general keys. So for the rest of the talk, let me say something about this upper bound and why it turns out to be very much non-trivial. In fact, it turns out that even for the 1-bit key special case, the result is very much non-trivial, and there are many natural barriers towards achieving this result. So essentially in the 1-bit special case, right, the result says we can sort 1-bit keys in a linear size circuit. I also want to mention that in the problem formulation, besides the 1-bit key, every element also has a payload string. And when you sort, you have to carry the payload string around, because otherwise, had it not been the payload string, right, you could just like count how many ones there are and then write down the answer. Before I talk about, even why the 1-bit case has many barriers, let me actually quickly mention that the 1-bit case has a very cool implication. It implies that median can be computed in the linear size circuit as well. Remember in your undergrad algorithms class, we learned the textbook Blum's algorithm for computing median on a RAM. And we know that it can be computed in linear time deterministically on a RAM. And in fact, this is one of my favorites when I teach undergrad algorithms. So you'd almost expect that, I mean, of course, naturally, you should be able to do the same, in a linear size circuit. But it turns out to be much harder than you might expect. And no one really knows how until our work. In some sense, the natural barriers for sorting 1-bit key also apply to median too. And for both of these problems, sorting 1-bit keys and median, in the circuit model, like believe it or not, the prior best known solution is actually AKS sorting circuits itself, and nothing better is known so far. And so to help you understand why, for something so natural, like it's so natural that if I didn't tell you it's hard, you'd almost take for granted. And let me explain why there are natural barriers. So the first barrier was actually described even in Knud's textbook from the 1970s. And the textbook said essentially such a result would not have been possible in the comparator-based model. And the reason is because of the 0-1 principle, right? So the 0-1 principle said any comparison-based sorting circuit, if it can sort 0-1 keys, it can also sort general keys. So therefore, the n log n lower bound for comparator-based sorting actually applies even to the 1-bit key case. Okay, well, to the best of our knowledge, all existing sorting circuit constructions indeed are in the comparison-based model. It's been a natural question, like whether we can achieve anything better using non-comparison-based techniques. Nothing is known, and this is not like the RAM's model. Right? In the RAM model, we know how to make use of non-comparison-based techniques to get interesting results. The second barrier was actually recently shown in our own work, as well as a work by Afshani and others. Okay, so it turns out for the 1-bit key special case, if you require stability in the sorting, again, there's an n log n barrier. And again, the barrier holds either assuming the indivisibility model or the Lilly narrow coding conjecture. Here, stability means that for the elements with the same key, we insist that their order in the output array must respect their relative order in the input array. Okay, so to get a linear sized sorting circuit for 1-bit keys, not only do we have to forego the comparison-based restriction, we also have to forego stability. So finally, when we overcome these barriers and we are eventually able to construct a sorting circuit for 1-bit keys, the next question is how to upgrade it to a sorting circuit for k-bit keys. And here we encounter another challenge. And the challenge is exactly because the 1-bit sorting circuit is not stable, right? Had it been stable, you know, a natural idea would be to use radix sort. But radix sort expects that the 1-bit sorting case, you know, is stable. So in fact, to do this upgrade, we came up with a new technique, which is like a clever 2-parameter recursion technique. Okay, so I won't have time to go into details. Let me quickly comment about the techniques at a very high level. So essentially, we start with Pippinger's self-routing superconcentrator. Imprecisely speaking, if we directly converted his superconcentrator construction to the circuit model, it would incur n log n. But then we can rely on a cool observation that was actually made in an earlier work on constructing small depth perfect oblivious parallel RAM. So in this work, we observed that Pippinger's superconcentrator construction actually has an online phase and an offline phase. So interestingly, the offline phase depends only on metadata, and it never looks at the element's payload strings. And also, interestingly, it's also the offline phase that's causing the n log n, whereas the online phase is easier to implement in the linear size circuit. So by exploiting the fact that the offline phase operates only on metadata, we are able to use a recursive bootstrapping technique to essentially squash the n log n to something like n poly log star n. So last but not the least, let me say a few words about how this is related to optimal ORAM. In optimal ORAM, we essentially need an oblivious algorithm that sorts 1-bit keys in linear time, and this is on the RAM, right? So to get that, we also rely on Pippinger's superconcentrator construction, and we rely on the same offline online insight. But then to get rid of the n log n in the oblivious RAM model actually almost requires, like in some sense, the opposite techniques from the circuit model, right? So on the RAM model, we know that every word has log n bits, and we can simultaneously perform log n bitwise operations in unit cost, you know, because this is like operation on a single word. So therefore, on oblivious RAM, one of the core techniques we use is packing. But you know, packing is like, there's no free packing in the circuit model. Like in the circuit model, every wire, every gate would have counted. So therefore, the algorithm tricks we use in the circuit model is actually rather different. Okay, I guess this is about as much as I can say about this line of work. To summarize, it's almost surprising that after so many years, we still don't understand sorting circuits. In fact, you know, it looks like we've been pretty stuck since the 1980s. So we were able to actually push the frontier of our understanding a little bit, both in terms of upper and lower bounds. Thank you so much for your attention.